Hi, everyone. And I think we're waiting to bring in Sedale as well. So give us a couple minutes to do that.
I'm here.
Awesome. We're just going to spotlight your video. Yay. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be taking over for Wendy for fun facts. Wendy founded the Women's Entrepreneurship Day, and she's going to join us either a little bit later or definitely for the crypto panel later on. So impromptu moderator at the ready. I'm very excited to introduce Breen from the fourth floor, as well as Jen, who is a fourth floor member and the chief story engineer for Go Beyond, as well as Sedale, who's the CEO of OpenGrants. So with this, we're going to be talking some about entrepreneurship, some about building logic-based communities, and a little bit about logic storytelling and story engineering. But I thought if Breen and Jen, if you guys kind of want to kick it off and just Breen, maybe give some background to the community of entrepreneurs that you're building. And Jen, if you want to share a little bit about how you found out about the fourth floor and how it's been valuable to you as a founder.
Sure, absolutely. And first off, thank you so much, Chelsea, for inviting me here and the fourth floor here to speak. We are really excited to be a part of this great discussion today, and it has been really fascinating, everything that's been discussed. So thank you very much for having us here. Just by way of background, the fourth floor is on a mission to get more women onto boards and cap tables. And one of the reasons why women have difficulty landing corporate board seats is because they're turned down for lack of experience. And so we are hacking the system and providing a place for women to initiate and then also advance for-profit board careers, earn equity, and invest by tapping into the underleveraged value of women entrepreneurs, and also by creating and aggregating for-profit board opportunities through our Pay It Forward initiative. So like if you boil it all down at its core, we're a networked marketplace where for-profit board investment and funding opportunities are being exchanged as a way to address the gender wealth and funding gap. And we're doing that by getting women onto boards and cap tables. So, all about creating balance.
Thank you, Breen. Jen, do you want to share a little bit just about why the fourth floor and why story engineering and your passion for this space? And I believe on our prep call, I may remember that you're very familiar with these logical fallacies. So maybe put in a little bit about your passion for logic as well.
Totally. Yeah. So to piggyback on what Breen said, the fourth floor, I wouldn't even know about this event without the fourth floor, which I think intrinsically speaks to the value that the organization has created. What I look for in organizations that I join, right, because there's just so many of them now in the internet era, is networks that are online but translate into real world value, because I think it's really important that we not lose ourselves in the digital sphere. As powerful as this technology is, right, we can sort of lose how that's impacting everyday real life relationships. The other thing that I absolutely loved about the fourth floor is that they, to steal from the UN, who sort of originated this concept of he for she, is they've really gone out and tried to figure out how they can bridge that divide, right? Because we've done this experiment for thousands of years of like the patriarchy, right? And now we've had feminism for a few hundred where we're trying to sort of swing the pendulum this way. But eventually the goal is this sort of humanistic world where we all work together and it's inclusive and we have representational parity. And what we don't want to happen is like a middle school dance where there's like guys on one side, girls on the other, and they never talk to each other. And so I think the fourth floor has done a really good job of that. I actually came to them through Dave Kirpin, who's a mentor at EO and head of Kirpin Ventures. And so, what I love that the fourth floor has done is gone out into these other communities to say, look, how do we bridge this gap that women aren't just talking to other women, but we're figuring out how to have impact in the world at large. It's not by women for women, it's by women for everyone. So that is something I'm super passionate about. And then I'm equally passionate about logic. You cannot be an electrical engineer, story engineer, really any kind of engineer and not love logic. One of my favorite sort of facts about logic is that there's three fundamental laws of logic of like truth. but there's over 24 logical fallacies, right? And so we lately see a lot of people online opining we live in this post-truth world and that the internet has created a post-truth world. But the reality is we've always lived in a world where it is much more difficult to distinguish, truth from non-truth, or, reverie from reality. And so what the internet has done is it's given us a ton more information. So it has given us a ton more truth, but it's also given us a ton more disinformation and logical fallacies, right? And so weeding through that is something that we do a lot of at Go Beyond. We work in story engineering and AI and blockchain and Web 3.0, and we're really focused on how can we tell stories in a way, how can we share information in a way that's much more truthful and inclusive and sustainable. And the reason I'm sort of a techno optimist about this is that if you look over the last several thousand years of human history, right, our dominant information sharing paradigms was oral tradition. And oral tradition is terrible. If you've ever played the telephone game, you know how inaccurate oral tradition can be, right? And the other thing that came out of oral traditions is that we had to find a way to make things as memorable as possible to make them truthful. So we had to distill them to these sort of black and white memorable tropes of like, here's a hero and here's a villain. And if the hero triumphs over the villain, we celebrate. And if the hero loses against the villain, it's a tragedy and it's a moralizing tale. And most of our storytelling up until this point falls into those biases because we've had thousands of years of training of that's how information should get shared and be memorable. And then we got the, handwriting came along and that was really time consuming. And then, 15th century, we finally got the printing press, but you could only print one page at a time. It was still really time consuming to share information. And so we mostly got the Bible and the Quran and like the Vedas and like biblical stories, religious stories that were in those hero journey tropes. And then the internet happened in the 80s. And this was an explosion of information. But anybody who remembers the early days of chat rooms, right? I couldn't smile the way I'm smiling on this call. I had to have an ASCII with 2 dots and a dash and a parentheses. And that was the way that I smiled in the early digital days of the internet. And now we have this, like the last 2 years, we've had 90% of the information that was created on the internet was created in the last 2 years, right? We have an explosion of video, we have an explosion of audio. We've gone from this black and white world of information to Technicolor. And what that enables us to do is to finally tell stories in a way that's much more truthful. Because if you look historically at Renaissance periods or, industrial revolutions, women in diverse communities were always playing a huge part in those breakthroughs, but it was only recently that we could be credited and compensated for that work, right? And so you're just now starting to uncover those hidden figures, literally in films like Hidden Figures. We did a piece on Emily Warren Roebling, who built the Brooklyn Bridge, but we're just now starting to uncover that like women have been here all along, diverse communities have been here all along contributing, but it was really only the last several decades where we could get credit and compensation for that work. And so what we're really passionate about at Go Beyond as we build these more logical futures is this idea that we want to, from day one, really be crediting people moving forward that are doing the huge breakthroughs that are changing the world and giving them that credit and giving them that compensation and telling more truthful stories and data frameworks. And so whether that's the mRNA vaccines, right, that have basically pushed back on COVID, which originally were developed by a female scientist, right? Or like you have CRISPR with Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. We want to start to like have it be that the narrative we're doing moving forward is we're not just chasing all the hidden figures from the past, but we're telling the stories now with big companies, with organizations, with tech companies and capital institutions of how they're using diverse teams to innovate moving forward.
I think Jen did a really good job of explaining some really important points. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sedale to talk a little bit about open grants as well. But some of the things that Jen mentioned that I think were really important are, a lot of what I think that the UN thought about in creating this day is reminding us that the world is not black and white, right? That we have to come together to move forward. And while I certainly don't want another global pandemic, I think it was very helpful in terms of kind of resetting the world and allowing us to maybe think through things differently and think through what it means to listen to one another. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sedale. Sedale, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about, I think something that Jen touched on really well was this concept of, the internet seemed too good to be true, or how could we believe that that would exist? Or there are a lot of technologies and or advancements in the world where it's like really a steep curve to get people to be educated that this is possible, but then once it's there and we experience it as a part of experiential learning, there's literally no going backwards, right? So I'd love if maybe you share a little bit about your background, but also some of the advancements that you're putting, I know, into the philanthropic space, and grants is one of them. So would love to hear about Open Grants and what you're creating.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to share. I guess, a little bit of my background and kind of what made me passionate both about kind of economic equality and also just working in the space that I do work in. I spent a lot of time as a management consultant. I was based in Argentina for some time, then based in Asia. And, the discrepancy between obviously the wealth gap there is just like remarkably, like it's very easy to see. Sometimes I think in some developed countries, like in the United States, it's a little bit harder sometimes to actually see that in front of you. But in Argentina and in many places in Asia, it's literally right in front of you all the time. And so got very passionate about, focusing on how do we achieve economic equality for people? How do we provide access to resources for all these groups that, frequently were just completely left out of the equation? And so our work at Open Grants really focuses on, and I guess I'll just preface this with a fact that I still find shocking, even though, this is the space that I work in, is that 98% of all of the cancer research money from the NIH went to like white dudes who are over 50. And that was in 2019. And that's just like, that's just one example of how terribly broken the grant funding ecosystem is in terms of equality and representation. It's just terribly broken. And one of the things that I love that Jen said, and now I don't know if you said it or I just intuited it from the words that you said, but it was something along the lines of like, logic really helps, this technology now really helps us like stick to like a proper story. We're able to really memorialize stories much more efficiently. And so one of the things that's really exciting about the technology that we have now, when you think about the process of awarding grant funding, is that we now have the opportunity to really like look at a lot more applications and a lot more data points around impact and consider those. And we can use a lot of technology to start to do that initial collection of impact and who's doing what. And we can write these digital identities on chain and connect those identities to impact and results. And then we can also connect those impacts and results to money. And we can draw correlations between how much money was given to a certain identity and what kind of impacts that then generated. And so all of that is to say that in short, what Open Grants is working on is building single on-chain identities that would really do away with the idea of grant funding as a sort of application process, and instead would just tie it to outcomes and results, right? So you take away a lot of that inequality and you start to address in a much more mathematical and logical way how we deploy capital to drive solutions. Because of course, it's not all going to be women who are driving cancer research forward, but the representation should be a whole lot better, right? Like just logically, you can't be getting good results if that's what your representation looks like when you're deploying capital. And that's just like one example. Unfortunately, this is really endemic to the whole grant funding space. There's a lot of barriers to access. And grant capital, just as an additional insight to what we're working on at Open Grants, the reason we focused on that is because it really is, it's this capital source that's very altruistic. It's not really, it's very much detached from sort of economic returns. And it's about, it's really useful for de-risking technology before it goes, maybe to more of a commercialization phase and you're getting VC money and other capital involved. So as a vehicle for capital, there's $2 trillion in grant money just kind of floating around the world. And unfortunately, it's very bureaucratic and hard to access. And there's a lot of these problems in terms of representation. So that's, a little bit of my background in terms of, that's where I came from, and really excited about some of the projects we're working on. And how we are starting to approach foundations who are also on board. And that's been the exciting thing, is as we've started to roll these solutions out, we find people who are excited to participate and very interested in this kind of new paradigm of funding anything from research to housing to simply providing aid to people who need it.
Sedale, I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Breen for another question. But as you've kind of gone through this project of trying to tie grant funding to outcomes and sort of almost like accelerate that process, right? Have you found resistance to what you're trying to create? And for the founders out there that have had challenges and or faced folks that maybe don't quite understand the technology behind your doing or don't exactly understand how it will better the world, how do you continue to drive your passion for the project forward? So just on the theme of resistance and how you deal with it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in any space, especially when you get money involved, there's a lot of ego tied into how money is deployed, and people tend to tie their egos to this in particular more than other things. So yeah, there's definitely lots of resistance or simply people are just like, this is never going to work. But on the other side, and once again, kind of leaning into the sort of logical approach to life, there's really a whole lot of data that says, hey, the way you're doing grant funding right now works about as well as randomly throwing money out the window. Like your results are pretty much the same. You're going to get some winners, but it's a lot of losers. And so there's a really cool paper that came out several years ago, and it was published as a peer-reviewed journal in InBio. It was about funding specifically for science and research that said, look, we might as well use a weighted lottery and get better representation, and the performance of all this money would really improve. So by the same token, there's a lot of resistance, but there's also a lot of fans. And so we are, very much as a company, very much leaning into that and encouraging our community to get involved in a variety of ways. And we're very excited about where that's headed. So I'd say like our cheering section really is the community, and we continue to engage with them, and they really do inspire us to keep doing cool stuff.
That's awesome. And I love that you pointed to when you're faced with figuring out, maybe folks that don't think that something's going to work, going back to the data, going back to figuring out, are there credible sources that you can share, and working together to, really evaluate, like, are you doing the best that you can to move forward? So with that, I want to turn it to Breen. Breen, I think you shared with me that the fourth floor is up to some exciting new initiatives in this coming year. And I was wondering if you kind of wanted to share a little bit about that, and also just how you made the decisions to set up the models that you're moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to. And I have to say, everything about OpenGrants, I love I love everything you just said, and I entirely relate. And I actually see pretty compelling parallels with what we are doing at the fourth floor. So, it's really a similar kind of, total inequity, but like lack of complete information and lack of representation and lack of access that we are tackling at the fourth floor. Our focus has to do with gender diversity and diversity in general in boardrooms and on cap tables, but it's a very similar thing. So just found that incredibly compelling. The Pay It Forward initiative is really this new initiative we're launching this year that we're really excited about, that it enables us to bring the value of the fourth floor ecosystem to all companies everywhere. So we got our start, we created our marketplace, our networked marketplace, by focusing on women-led ventures, women-led startups, and women who were seeking board and investment careers. And then that created the foundation that then Pay It Forward enables us to build upon, but bring in everybody else. Because our goal, it's not just to get women onto the boards and cap tables of women-led companies, it's to get women onto boards and cap tables so that we have this balance, so that there is that representation, so that ultimately we're unlocking wealth and innovation. So it's not, like what you just said, Sedale, the equivalent of like throwing money out the window. It's a little bit like that when you look at composition of in boardrooms, the demographics of boardrooms, who's sitting around that table. I mean, it's not quite throwing money out the window, but it's certain insular networks that are just reaching kind of, whatever's comfortable and within reach, similarity, proximity, and familiarity. And then you're getting a similar type of person sitting around every single boardroom, whether you're talking about smaller companies or large companies. And that's myopic, and there's so many problems. So pay it forward, the way that it works, it's a pledge. We are asking all companies to take the pledge and join us in combating the gender, wealth, and funding gap by getting women onto boards and cap tables. They participate directly by allocating at least one board-related opportunity to our exchange, because the fourth floor is an exchange. It doesn't have to be a director seat. It can be an advisor role, a board observer role. And if they don't have one at the ready, they have to create one, which they can do. And so they, partners create this opportunity, they give it to us, it goes into our board seat exchange, we find them a diverse candidate, and they also have to nominate at least 2 women who meet our criteria for membership to join us at the fourth floor so they can advance their own for-profit board careers. So each partner is directly advancing at least 3 for-profit board careers for women. And we have in this structure, there's ways for organizations to be greater impact partners if they're able to amplify this initiative in different ways, possibly by bringing it to portfolios of companies, et cetera. Our goal, big picture, is to advance 75,000 for-profit board careers by 2025. We can do this if we get 20,000 pay it forward partners by 2025, which we can do, but we have to start with a bang this year. We have to get 1,000 partners to come on board by December of 2022. So we believe we can do it. We hope we can do it. And then we should be off to the races. And the goal there is to really drive systemic change.
I really love, and we have quite a few NOVA members that are really interested in the fourth floor as well. And one of our founding principals, Anne-Marie McComb, was really passionate about the work that Breen was doing. And I think as it relates to Logic Day, what's exciting about this is I think Breen's done a really good job at looking at a problem around why are maybe tables not as balanced? Why do we not have capital going where it needs to go? And Sedale's done the same thing, as is Jen. So you're all looking at, these kind of world problems, but figuring out alternative solutions and ways to tackle them. And I think whether that's through technology or that's through finding a really accessible pathway to literally put human capital behind something, to really figuring out what's the story and how do we figure out the angle of that? How do we deconstruct that to move the needle? I think the 3 of you are doing and tackling that in a really unique and special way. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so we're coming up to closing time-ish, but I did want to turn it back over to Jen. And Jen, I kind of wanted to ask you about, in terms of this concept around story engineering, I've heard storytelling a whole lot, but I haven't necessarily heard story engineering. And I wanted to kind of understand, for viewers, what is it? And also, what's the why behind this title? How did you decide on this? And what made you passionate about moving into that space?
Yeah, totally. So it had come, originally I was an electrical engineer who thought I was going to save the planet from climate change. And so I worked at the DOE and Freedom Car when Tesla launched. I worked at the biggest utility company in the country in renewables and several high growth startups. And basically across the board, forgive this joke, but everyone was pale, male, and a little overly hailed. I was typically the only woman in the room. And the most melanin we usually got were my freckles. And that, became a problem because engineers would opine that they'd make these amazing technological breakthroughs, but they couldn't scale them, and they would blame politics and they'd blame media. But the reality is it's because they didn't have diverse communities that have to use the technology involved in the engineering process from day one. And so I became much more interested in social engineering, which, I now call story engineering. The first iteration of this was a nonprofit I started while I was still in college, and we did educational events to bring diverse communities together. And I recently had a Marvel casting director compare them to Stark Expos, and my inner 5-year-old kind of did a backflip They had pre-COVID about 75,000 attendees at the event we started in downtown Raleigh. So they kind of live on, but even then you would spend all year planning an event to get all these people together and get them excited. And then you'd spend the next year planning all year to get them back at the event. And so I started realizing that I wanted a media and tech solution to solving this problem. And so out of that, Go Beyond was born, and we're a media and tech innovation lab. And the reason we talk about story engineering, and everyone on our team has a title of story engineer that works in these frameworks, is that, you know, storytelling is sort of the old technology, right? When we literally tell a story, it's oral traditions. But now stories are engineered, right? They're using data, they're using visual cues, they're using auditory cues, they're building soundscapes, we're using AI to tell stories in different ways, right? And so I think it's really important to think about that story is one of the oldest technologies, and it's going through this rapid update. And it's really important to have diverse communities part of that process, right? Like, you know, a lot of people talk about how blockchain or crypto is a flash in the pan and a gold rush, and then it'll be like the next .com bubble. But we ignore the fact that the .com bubble gave us some great technologies, right, that we're all using today. Like the first iteration didn't quite work the way that it should. Nobody uses Alta Vista the way that they do today, use Google, but that was the early impetus of it. And so while blockchain and AI and all these systems, machine learning will continue to evolve, it's really important in the genesis to have diverse communities a part of both how that technology is developed and how the stories and narrative around that technology evolves. And so that's sort of the origin of why we call ourselves story engineers.
I really love that. And I think to your point, right, we are seeing advances in AI, et cetera, but how do you ensure that people are at the forefront of the technology? But I hadn't even thought about, I know that's something that human logic is something that the Logic Tree team and leadership is really passionate about, but also thinking through the narrative piece on that and why it's important to have people helping to craft the narratives. That's a completely different viewpoint. Well, I think we're wrapping up this particular panel, but it's been really neat to kind of think through different advances and things that you all are working on. And thank you so much to Breen, Sedale, and Jen for being willing to share your stories, your passion for logic, your passion for what you're building, and how you're combating resistance in the world as you move forward. So thanks to this group of panelists. We're going to transition out of this part of the program on gender equality and SDG Goal 5. So just as a quick summary, we went from climate change, which was SDG Goal 14, into gender equity and some about entrepreneurship, which is SDG Goal 5. And now we're headed into quality education, which is SDG Goal 4. So bear with us as we get started with the next panel. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.